This morning, what came to mind are my grandchildren. I have four beautiful grandchildren and I wonder how their lives are going to be. We always say, oh, back in the olden days. Well, it was completely different back in the olden days, but I'm kind of wondering how it's going to be for their future. Hi, I'm JT, and this is my corner, and I think about my mom and my grandmother and grandfather and father, and my mom grew up in a little town that had 50 people and no electric, no water. They used rainwater to take a bath and, wash their hair and wash the floors. But they had to go down to the middle of the city, to the city well, and get buckets of water every day so that they had drinking and cooking water. And they lived in Hungary, way out in the country. My grandfather worked for the government. He tilled their land and grew vegetables and, oversaw the gardening. They took the food from the farms and shipped it to the city. And so he was like a supervisor for that. And my grandmother was a stay-at-home mother. And she baked and she did canning, and in this city where they lived, my grandfather built a wall around their house, a tall wall, so that people couldn't see inside. And he raised his own vegetables, and he grew flowers. He grew my grandmother's favorite flowers, which were daisies, and which are mine. And they had few pigs and chickens, and that's how they lived. My mother was the youngest of one of three children, and every month, her and my grandfather would ride into town to a market, and they would take, my grandfather made sausages, and my grandmother canned and baked bread, and they would take their wares and some of the vegetables that they grew into the market, like a farmer's market. And that's how they made some extra money, for living. My grandfather made sure that he bought a little something for my grandmother, like a new apron or a new dress or some laces for her shoes, but he never forgot to bring her something back. And I remember my mother saying that neither my grandfather nor grandmother, were very talkative, but every day after dinner, my grandfather would go outside and he would smoke his pipe, and my grandmother would go join him while my mother and her sister did the dishes and cleaned up. And she said that from the inside they could hear them talking and laughing, like they were little, newlyweds. And that was an everyday thing that they did, talked about everything. Like, you don't know what they talk about because they weren't doing much, but they just talked. And a funny thing, back then, things were completely different. When my uncle died, he was in the military, and my mother remembers the soldiers coming to the gate and announcing that my uncle had died, and my grandfather just lost it. He was by himself and introverted for a long time after that. And when my mother turned 17, they went to the market, and this is the last time that she remembers going to the market. And she said on the way home, her father didn't say one word, but when they got home, her and my mother, grandmother and grandfather sat down and had a discussion that one of the military generals' wives were having a baby, and they needed a nanny. And they wanted to know if my mother, would be a nanny for them, So my father and my mother decided that they would sell my mother, not sell her like that, but if she went to take care of the general's wife, then the general would compensate my grandmother and grandfather until she was there. So they packed her bags, and my grandfather took her in to Budapest. And when they arrived, my mom said there was this huge mansion, with these gates that they had to go through. And when they went in, this mansion, there was a stairway all the way up, and there was like chandeliers, and everything was just amazingly different than it was back in the country. She had never been to the city like that, and there were trolleys and cars and people walking the streets, and that was the moment that she decided that one day she was going to be famous and rich, just like these people. So when she went in, she went through the kitchen, and she saw the maids and the butlers cooking and preparing for dinner, and the head, whoever she was, the head woman, took her back to the back into this little room that was prepared for her. There was a bed and 2 uniforms, gray uniforms with aprons. There was a bathroom, and her job every day was to take food up to the mistress, help her get dressed, and bathe her if she needs it. And she would be climbing up and down the steps every day, all day, until the baby is born. And that was her job. And her other job was, when the milkman came, she would take the cheese and the milk and put it up into the cold pantry. And if they sent her on an errand, that was her job. That's what she did. And that's how she met my father. My father was a milkman, and he delivered milk to their back, and he was a handsome, blue-eyed, cocky, Hungarian. And the first time that she saw him, her heart fluttered. Of course, she acted like she was shy, but he wanted to know her name. And she said, "My name's Helen." And she said, "And what's yours?" And he said, "My name is Pista," which is Hungarian for Steve. And so they saw each other, once a week when the milkman came. And one thing led to another. He asked her out, and a few years later, I think she was 16 when she went to Budapest, and when she was 18, they decided to get married. And so they got married, and she got a job at the light factory, and he continued to be a milkman, and then later on also got a job at the making light bulbs in the factory. And the general, this was after the mistress had her baby, the general gave them an apartment, a basement apartment in Hungary, so that they could start their life, on the assumption that she would come and clean and take care of the baby occasionally when they needed it. So that was way back then. And now everything is AI, and now nobody wants to really, young people don't really want to, work or clean. So I often wonder, what's going to be with them. Hopefully everything will be fine, because they're smart, wonderful kids, and their parents are great. But I'm going to continue the story about Helen and Pista. I hope you like it, and I'll bring it up to today. See ya.